lyrics that you shared with us, those rap artists, they really were talking about transcending ethnicity and clan and tribe. And we all know that this is very much a challenge on the African continent. From Cape Town to Cairo, Accra to Nairobi, we know that the continent is full of a diverse array of ethnicities and groups of people. We've seen the tragedy of ethnic violence. We don't need to mention Rwanda and Burundi and what happened during the presidential elections in Kenya with the Kikuyu and the Luo. And so, could you please speak to the power of hip-hop artists and their consciousness around using language to transcend tribe and ethnicity? Is there room for tribe and ethnicity? Or are we looking for one cultural identity from what your research has indicated to you?
Okay, so I think there is room. I think there's two things that are simultaneously happening. Both an aim to retain and preserve kind of cultural heritages. So for example, there's an indigenous hip hop gathering that happens in Kampala every year, and part of it is stressing kind of artists using their own indigenous languages and not using English, not using French, but the maintenance and celebration of African languages. Not in the sense of separation to say, you know, to use it as a way to divide themselves, but as a way to say we need to preserve these languages. And we need to, if you want to speak to the people, you need to speak in the language that people most understand. And in many countries across Africa, it's not English and French, especially if you're looking at many of the urban youth. But it's at the same time embracing a global Black identity. So you have artists that will represent, in the same song sometimes, represent a national identity, global African identity, as well as a continental African identity. So you have all of these that kind of come together, and it comes together with them saying that they're representing Africa, but also in using hip-hop and African-American vernacular English to express themselves. So when you use slang that is familiar within hip-hop culture globally, you're speaking to a specific audience and you're identifying yourself as being part of a certain community. And so I think in using African-American English as well as local dialects and kind of mixing it up, you're expressing a Pan-African identity. I do think that there are some cases, again, where there's imitation and people trying to be Western or trying to be American, but oftentimes you see expressions of, for example, identification with Malcolm X or identifications with the Black Panthers or other movements, and people will throw kind of things into their lyrics to suggest that, you know, I'm like, you know, the African Malcolm X or what have you, the Nigerian Malcolm X, to show that they have this identity. But you also see African artists using other African languages. Being Tanzanian, I'm always aware when I hear, for example, a Ghanaian artist switch from tree to using a couple Swahili words, because you know, I don't speak tree. And so when I hear the Swahili, it's always like, you know, did they just throw in some Swahili? So you see that sometimes. And I notice Swahili more because I speak Swahili. But I also think, of course, when you kind of go back to the conversation that happened decades ago about the use of Swahili continentally, and kind of like the proposition that it may be elevated to a continental language and not just used in the East African countries that use it. And so now you're hearing some African artists actually throwing in some Swahili or throwing in languages that are not from their region, that are not from their ethnic group. Ghanaian artists will rap in Tree, Ga, and Ewe. And they may maybe not even be any of the three, but will throw in each. And so you definitely have the preservation of African languages, representations of continental African identities, but also representations of global African identities found in the music.
Asante sana. Najua Kiswahili kidogo. Okay, now Netfa, during your talk, you talked about a couple of things. You used the word revolution, a word that we're hearing particularly now during the presidential debate, uttered by, I believe it was Bernie Sanders, who talks about a political revolution. You use the term revolution with respect to the need to bring about the Pan-African vision. You also talked about the importance of transcending class as well as the Pan-African project coming from the ground up. Could you shed some deeper light on any one of those three? You can stand up.
I don't remember exactly if I said transcending class, but let me give some.
No, we're asking, that's the question we're asking, based
okay.
on the classlessness you talked about.
So, well, class divisions are here already. They're here, they're a reality. And so I think the problem is that in their reality, even in socialist countries like Cuba, socialism as a misnomer is put out there as supposed to be a classless society. A lot of times people just don't study even the differences between communism and socialism or what those things mean. And socialism by necessity, out of the fact that we live in a class contentious capitalist society in which the bourgeoisie and the minority and all the people, the power controls and owns everything. To me, and this is just, a lot of other people, the next step has to be for those who work and control, those who work and produce and labor and toil should be in control. So it's not a classless society, it's just switching which class is in control. And that's what a socialist revolution is. And so maybe it's eventually, and I guess it's the utopia of communism or whatever, where there eventually might be a classless society, but that's a little too far down the line for my thinking, and not really something that I think we can be concerned with right now. And so I think one thing I appreciate about the Cuban Revolution is they talk about the battle of ideas. And I think this is where we really need to, and even hip hop and everything is really talking about, really engaged in a battle of ideas. And as the Cubans say, ideas are more powerful than weapons. With the right idea, you can get a African soldier who's fighting on behalf of the United States in Vietnam to turn around and shoot somebody else, the real enemy, based on the ideas. So it's not the gun that's in power, and I'm not trying to, guns don't kill people, people do. It's not, but it is about the ideas that we hold, and so we actually have to. And also, I want to also touch a little bit on this, the tribe and ethnicity thing. While I think that we Africans everywhere are stricken with the tribalism, and so while they might not have the same origins of what is considered tribe in the continent, they still right here. You'll see even our people in D.C. will talk about the challenges in D.C. as if these same challenges don't exist in Chicago or Accra or something like that. So we're even not thinking about, even when we have the consciousness and awareness to think about addressing our challenges, we don't often identify and understand that we have a universal connection. Just by our sheer circumstances in this world ties us together. And so once we recognize that idea, it becomes very powerful and opens up all types of ways for us to think about solutions and ways to challenge our circumstances. I think one of the, and I had this conversation with a brother a long time, years ago, and he was from the continent, and usually when we used to have to engage about being African from anyone, so I'm an African. Oh, what part of Africa are you from? And if you couldn't say that, you weren't really, from Africa, so I don't know, we don't know where we were from, and it's not really important. It's we were brought here from Africa, and and the circumstances are that we are African. And in fact, some of the places that you ask places, the type of identification and specificity that you asking me to deal with is a European construct, quite frankly. So we have to really get out of that. And so we know that we're African based on our conditions and our history and our culture and heritage and our culture. And this is, okay, I gotta be short. So one of the things that I challenge Africans born and raised on the continent who encounter Africans from here who don't understand themselves as being Africans is that you should just say African. And don't make a distinction African American, particularly when you're talking to a quote unquote African American. Because my experience, I remember I used to do my own little, evaluations of this survey, a survey about why we don't identify, why there's this division. People would say, Africans from the continent would say, well, it will boil down to, after big conversation, boil down to Africans or African Americans don't accept us. They don't see us as the same, and that's why they don't see themselves as an African. And then when you talk to the other side, after long conversations, it boils down to the same thing. Well, they don't see us as the same. That seems like an easier solution. Let's just all see ourselves as connected, right? Of course, it seems easy, but it really is about the battle of ideas and us raising the consciousness and drawing the parallels, the connections, the concrete material things that really bind us together and our circumstances. One God, one aim, one destiny is not regardless.
And that is a beautiful segue into Alexandra's discussion, which she talked about the theoretical proposition of Ruth Sims on the black community in Cuba. And so if you would just take the baton and respond to the implications that Netfa has just raised for the black Cubans, given the theoretical propositions of Ruth Sims.
Well, the original question you asked was, what are the indigenous sociological constructs of Pan-Africanism in Cuba? And it goes down to a concept called transculturation, which originates in Cuba, which I also expand upon in my work. But it's this idea that when you have people with similar yet distinctive knowledge frames, or completely distinctive knowledge frames, living in a space together, and they mix, clash, grapple, and form things that are indigenous to the land space, commonalities of that existence. In Cuba, from the onset of the African presence in about 1500, Africans, and these are predominantly West Central Africans, that were generalized as Congo, even though there was a very vast, multiplicitous conglomeration of ethnicities represented, connected with the indigenous Taino to fight against the colonial Spanish. And that unification under the concept of liberation, as well as commonalities of how both the Taino and West Central Africans engaged with spirits, engaged ritual activity, produced this transculturation process that created a multiplicitous identity of we are both indigenous, we are both African. And there are songs that continue on today that are sung in ritual activities for the dead, where they say, look at the Congo dressed as an Indio, look at the Indio dressed as a Congo. And so that idea of co-presence and understanding and appreciating that living in the same space and sharing the same space creates one layer of an identity commonality, but that there are also multiple ethnic identities that connect heritage. And you have people who contemporarily identify as, under their Cuban identity, as African, and underneath the African component as Haitian African, as Congo, as Yoruba, as Lukumi, as Arara, and as well as identifying with a Spanish heritage, with a Chinese heritage. And I think recognizing the spectrum within an individual and as well as a collectivity, that it can be all of. It can be national identity, local identity, regional identity, and then ethnic identity. Those are processes that are inherently human, and we can't be necessarily fixed into a single box category, because that in and of itself is a manifestation of white supremacy. And if we continue to expand upon that and recognize that spectrum, then that helps us conceptualize the complexity of humanness.
Thank you for those remarks. And before we open the discussion up to the audience, and I now would like to ask Dr. Gnaka to respond to his question and really share with us specifically how to connect the dots. We're moving from language and music to consciousness around class, to the transcending the colonization of the mind and the psyche, into how do we move forward and connect the dots in creating, as Netfa phrased it, this Pan-African project, building on the lessons learned from the past.
Thank you very much, Julius. I did not expect this conference to go the way it's going, because it looks like we spoke before meeting here today. And we did not, and if we were in the church, they will say that that's the work of the Holy Spirit, right? But we're not in the church, and this is what I'm going to say. There are two things that I forgot I wanted to mention when I was talking about the age of nationalism. We had, of course, I don't know why I forgot that. In Latin America, there was Simon Bolivar, who also was the leader, for the independence movement over there, and then who wanted to build a Grand Colombia, and who advocated the unity of those of the newly independent countries there. And then Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, came to give like a new leaf or a new breath, to the unity of Latin America, leaning on the resistance of Cuba, and that was something I intended to say. Now, yes, the question he asks is a very, very important question, because today, when you look at the World African Union, there are so many concepts. You will see so many people talking about the future, the destiny of Africa, and the unity of Africa, and there are different concepts. And then, of course, the battle of ideas in that particular case is very interesting. Let me mention some concepts that you